So hello everyone, just a quick introduction to the International Civil Society Centre based in Berlin. We're owned by 15 of the leading international civil society organisations, and our focus is on helping them to maximise their impact and resilience. And we play three strategic roles. We convene civil society sector practitioners and leaders with workshops and conferences. We analyse the latest innovations and future developments and how these may impact these organisations and the sector more broadly. And we provide a collaborative platform for joint projects which the ICSOs can collaborate on together. For instance, our Leave No One Behind project, which focuses on inclusive SDG monitoring in 12 countries. So this particular webinar is under our Scanning the Horizon platform, which is a collaborative community for future strategies, trends analysis and peer learning for the ICSOs. Sorry, could I just ask all new joinees to please mute your mics? Thank you. This is the fourth year since 2015 of the platform, and we have 23 members from ICSOs, from national CSO platforms such as Partos, and also from the private sector. We meet monthly online with these kind of webinars, which look at key future trends and also strategy and foresight processes. And we have an in-depth annual meeting every year, which looks at one topic. And this year in June, we're focusing on the rise of China and the impacts for international civil society sector organisations. So now I'm going to hand over to Anna Wies, who's going to do a quick introduction to Partos and the topic. Go ahead, Anna Wies.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Wies Kuipers. I'm working for Partos for 3 years now, especially in the platform, the Spindle, which is the innovation platform. Partos is the Dutch Association of Organizations Working in Development Cooperation, and we have about 100, a little less, members, and in total they're working 3,500 people. Since 3 years we have the innovation platform. That's a platform that is wanted by the members, but also by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Development Cooperation, because we think we can accelerate innovation in the sector. So we are doing different things. We look at trends and developments in that can be useful for the sector. So we have future sessions on technology, but also we saw anyway that there are lots of opportunities in cities, and not very many organizations in our members are working on this. So we would like to introduce the subject. So that's why we are going to do this seminar, webinar, and we have found a small movie that's telling about what are the opportunities and challenges. So if you can see that now. No sound. Vicky, you can't have sound with the movie?
Maybe that will work now.
Vicky, we don't have sound here anyway, but
Sorry?
There's no sound. I don't hear anything, maybe the others, but
Okay, sorry everyone. I don't know why that's not working. We'll send around the link. We'll send around the link when we send around the YouTube clip for the overall webinar. I do apologise about that. We'll go on with the presentation.
Yeah, and in the next slide, there are the challenges which are happening in these cities. And we think there's lots of possibilities to do work on that. So we had some sessions on cities already, and we're going to have future sessions, 3 of them. And the first one will be end of the month, and that will be done by Paula. And Paula is also now present to give this presentation on what's happening on the economic side and employment challenges and opportunities. So maybe, Paula, you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paula. I hope you hear me. And I'm working at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies at Erasmus University Rotterdam. And today I will give a presentation about urban labor markets in the global south. And specifically, I will talk about the informal economy in cities and the challenges and, yeah, but also potentials around it.
Okay, can I just check in the chat box? We're getting some messages that people are having problems hearing. Can people just drop a message? Okay, great. Okay, so you can hear. Okay, and I shall introduce Sanjeev. Did you want to speak to this slide quickly, Annelies?
It's an overview of what's happening in cities, and you can find this on the website of the German Development Cooperation Organization. But we will send you the link so you can read it when there's time.
Right, so yeah, so before Paula speaks, I'm really pleased that we're joined by Sanjeevani Singh from Habitat for Humanity. Sanjeev is Habitat's Director of International Housing Programmes, leading on global strategies and capacity building for the organisation's urban approach, liaising with area offices, national organisations and their implementing partners. She works on the integration of urban programme strategies with disaster resilience and advocacy strategies and initiatives that lead to increased housing solutions. And we're really excited that she's going to present their overall programming approach and also how they're analysing and incorporating these key trends in urbanisation into their work. So Sanjeev, can you unmute yourself? I can unmute you so that you can talk.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think we hear you well.
Excellent. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'm very excited to be part of this webinar this morning.
Thank you. So please go ahead with your presentation and then just tell me when to move the slides.
Excellent. Thank you. So essentially, the purpose of my presentation today is really to kind of share with you how Habitat for Humanity International is responding to the development challenges faced in urban areas, and essentially the need for adequate and affordable housing, including providing access to basic services, secure tenure and community infrastructure, and housing finance. And essentially this new approach that we have developed and are implementing really focuses on improving the quality, scale and impact of our work in urban areas. And was one of our 4 organizational commitments to Habitat 3 in 2016. And essentially, we see that facilitating access to adequate and affordable housing and upgrading informal settlements is really a fundamental component of achieving inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable development. Let's move on to the next slide. So just to give you a background in terms of who we are. So Habitat is an international housing NGO that is dedicated to facilitating the provision of adequate and affordable housing for low-income and vulnerable communities. We are based in 70 countries around the globe, and we are a federated structure, which means that we consist of some regional and branch offices and mostly national organizations that are affiliated to Habitat. Essentially, our core purpose is to facilitate increased access to adequate and affordable housing for low-income and vulnerable communities, and we strive to have impact at a community, sector, and societal level through really directly engaging communities, influencing market policy and systems, and creating greater awareness and engagement in the housing sector. Next. So if we look at the global trends that impact on the work that we do, I think we all know that the world is becoming increasingly more urban, and that already more than 55% of the world's population live in urban areas. And according to the United Nations, we know that this is set to increase to 68% by 2050. Essentially, what this means for us in terms of the housing sector is that access to adequate and affordable housing is a major challenge in urban areas across the world. What we see currently is that 1.6 billion people live in substandard housing. And in addition, due to kind of rapid urbanization, we see that 1 billion people currently live in slums. And this really translates to 1 in 8 people globally living in a slum or in an informal community. And I think the other interesting trend is that obviously the increasing concentration of urbanization is happening in Asia and Africa. Next slide. And then if we focus in a little bit more on Africa, I think the perception is that, Africa is really the least urbanized continent. However, as a trend, it's important to understand that Africa's future is really urban, and that 58% of Africa is expected to be urban by 2050. What we're seeing is that Africa will reach its tipping point by 2035, and by that stage, there will be 926 million people living in urban areas. I think another key trend to highlight is that Sub-Saharan Africa is regarded as the fastest urbanizing region and will be the youngest region by 2050. And all these trends really have an impact on the way that we are dealing with our programs and addressing these challenges in urban areas. Next slide. And then just sort of unpacking a little bit more the impacts of urbanization. We know that there are rapid rates of urbanization, especially in Africa and Asia, where we're seeing increasing number of people moving from rural areas to towns, to secondary cities and urban areas. And we know that the population of urban areas is increasing due to this migration, as well as natural population growth. Some of the trends that we're seeing, urbanization has been occurring since the Industrial Revolution. It's not something new, but I think the difference that we're seeing now is the rapid rate of urbanization without an industrial revolution, and really the inability of urban areas to cope with this rapid influx of people, and their inability to cope from not just an economic perspective, but also in relation to the provision of basic services, affordable housing, and infrastructure. And what we're really seeing is that, the impact of urbanization is that it's resulting in, the increasing informality of urban areas. We're seeing growing inequality between, the poor or low-income families and wealthy families. This discrepancy or this inequality is increasing. We're seeing that generally most people that are living now in urban areas, especially in the developing world, are living in informal areas, and really, that increases their susceptibility to climate change and other disasters and challenges. Next slide. So what does this all mean when we think about this? What does this mean for the work that we're doing? Essentially, this means that we're dealing with a complex and dynamic urban environment where already vulnerable and low-income communities are constantly dealing with various layers of social, economic, environmental, and political challenges. We are really looking at very different urban areas now than we previously did. The emerging reality is that what we're seeing is that if more than 50% of a city is informal and the majority of residents are living in informal settlements, then really it's necessary to rethink how we support the growth and development of urban areas and how we facilitate access to basic services, secure tenure, affordable housing. And I think the key thing is that because urban areas are so different and there's such an increased level of informality, traditional mechanisms, have to be, in terms of how we address development, need to be rethought. Next slide. So essentially, given all these challenges, how is Habitat approaching this? And essentially, we have developed what we call our global urban approach. And essentially, this approach emphasizes the importance of taking a more comprehensive, integrated, collaborative, and responsive approach to the way we operate in urban areas. And essentially, there's three things we want to achieve. We want to be able to meet the needs of low-income and vulnerable communities, to meet the housing and basic services needs. We want to be able to contribute towards systemic market and policy enhancements. And then overall, we want to also contribute towards a common development vision that has been created by the global development frameworks, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, the new Urban Agenda, the Sendai Framework. And we really want to be able to contribute towards the creation of inclusive, safe, and sustainable and resilient cities. So what does the urban approach do? It really provides our organization with a more integrated and consistent approach for Habitat to address the challenges faced in urban areas across the globe by providing some consistency in terms of providing some common principles. Our core principles include things like a people-centered approach, partnerships, a systems approach to housing. We have a core strategic goal and strategic objectives. We have 4 thematic areas. And then overall, we have programmatic guidelines that include assessments and at various levels, including assessing the housing markets, the contextual conditions, looking at the housing environment to really design, appropriate interventions. And I think the key new thing about this approach is that what we say that in order to address these challenges, you really require interventions not just at a community level, but you require interventions at a market and policy level to really bring about systemic and more sustainable changes and development. And like I said, the essence of this approach is really involves conducting assessments to really provide a deeper understanding of the context and community needs and priorities, and then ensuring that we utilize these assessments to co-create with various community, public, and private stakeholders, appropriate interventions. And essentially what we're seeing is that partnerships and collaboration are essential to this approach, and then really thinking about sustainability. So not just working at a community level and delivering projects and enhancing standards of living, but really thinking about the entire ecosystem and thinking about how we can address constraints and gaps in the housing ecosystem or in the development ecosystem to ensure that we can have long-term outcomes and impacts. Next slide. So really what we're seeing for Habitat is that we're seeing that as we work in urban areas, different types of urban models are emerging based on the context. We're seeing that in some areas we are having strategic partnerships, such as the one we have in Liberia, where we're part of a more comprehensive urban upgrading program, which is led by Cities Alliance in collaboration with the government of Liberia and various development partners. And this country program really brings together partners around a common vision that promotes vertical and horizontal integration of government, communities, and development partners. In other areas, we're seeing thematic areas of focus, for example, with our Rely project, which is really a project that is funded by USAID, and it focuses on improving living standards in multi-apartment buildings in Eurasia, and really focusing on, pulling together efforts and resources and networks to address the impact of rising energy prices on collective housing. And then we have other thematic areas that are around migration models, and we're doing work in Lebanon with the Syrian refugees, really to address their needs. We also have what we see emerging is a number of coalitions and networks. This is an increasing way that we are operating. We have the urban practitioners, Urban Housing Practitioners Hub in our Latin American Caribbean region, which is really a unique multi-sector coalition of housing and urban specialists working to establish, dynamic knowledge management to improve the quality and design of housing practice and policy in that region. Then we have other types of coalitions, such as the Sensitize to Sanitize campaign in India, which is really about partnering with other NGOs and local government to improve awareness and find synergies to address the challenges around sanitation in India. We're also seeing what is emerging in several of our countries as a more comprehensive approach to urban programming, where we're involving various stakeholders, including community, public, and private sector stakeholders, where we're looking at a broader view to addressing the housing challenges, where we're basing a lot of work on comprehensive assessments and interventions that are functioning at various levels, like I said, at a community, market, and policy level. So these are sort of emerging models that we're seeing that are really contextually driven. Next slide. And based on our work in urban areas, what we're seeing is that there's some key requirements for urban programming. The one thing we're seeing that if you're going to design more comprehensive urban programs, what you really need is a coordinating body or urban platform that creates a common vision for all stakeholders to buy in, and really that promotes integration of sectors, programs, partners to achieve greater outcomes and impacts. I think given the challenge of urban areas, there's really a need for various partners to come together. It's no longer viable for just one organization to think that they can work alone and address these challenges in urban areas. We really need to come together and form these, urban platforms and coordinating structures. There's really a need for partnerships and really the establish of more inclusive, people-centered, public-private partnerships that are really built on trust, dialogue, and collaboration. I think this is essential for supporting good urban development. And then the other thing that's emerging is that there's a need for the creation of evidence-based interventions that not just operate at a community level, but are really looking at market conditions and addressing those, that are working at a sector level to enhance both the sector and policy environments to support more sustainable urban development. And the other key thing that we're seeing, especially in the developing world, is that there's a need for institutional capacity building, both in the public sector as well as the private sector, to support the sustainable implementation of these interventions. Next slide. And then this is just to give you some examples of the different types of interventions at these various levels. So if you're looking at a community level, I mean, what we're finding with our urban work, we have different entry points. So, you know, you could start with a wash project or a solid waste management project or a market development intervention and then grow this further. But there's different entry points, but these are the sort of interventions that we're seeing. For us at a market level, this really involves working with financial institutions and housing supply side organizations to really increase the products and services that are available for low income housing. It could be increasing access to housing microloans or increasing the supply of clay bricks or cement bricks for low income communities or households. It just depends on the context. At a policy level, it could include, I mean, for example, in Liberia, we're currently developing with the government of Liberia voluntary gender responsive policy relocation guidelines. We are looking into developing slum upgrading guidelines. It could include advocating around land rights. And then, like I said, institutional capacity building is really essential to support the implementation of these interventions. Next slide. And then really looking at sector implications. What does this mean for us as a sector? I think if we look at the sector today, what we see is that funding is still very sector specific, and there's a need to shift towards more larger integrated funding to address urban challenges. And this could be, for example, in a targeted community, looking at a more integrated or combined funding approach where you would look for funding, say, for a wash project, as well as to support market development at some level and some policy intervention at the same time. The key thing is that the sector needs some sort of more comprehensive urban program guidelines that provide some basic requirements around, for example, assessments. How do you build inclusive partnerships? How do you build public sector capacity and things like that? And then the other key thing is that there's really a need to break the silos for organizations and sectors to come together and promote the integration of sectors, of partners, of programs, of economies and communities to ensure that we're really taking a more comprehensive and holistic approach to the way that we support urban development. And that's it. That is the last slide. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sanjeev. That was really interesting, and I think what's particularly interesting is how you look at the context and you take a different role in each, but you do this within the framework of an overall strategic approach. We do have time for one or two questions, so if you have questions for Sanjeev, please either unmute and I will invite you to speak, or post your question in the chat. Okay, no one. I will ask one question. So, Sanjeev, what do you think? What would be your call to action for other international civil society organisations to really help move the sector forward on this? I mean, you've obviously been doing a lot of thinking about this within your own context, but what do you think are the key things for other organisations to think about?
So, thank you, Vicky. That's a great question. So I really think that there's a need for other civil society organizations, other development partners, really to come together to say, in targeted urban areas, how can we work better together? How can we create these urban platforms and create this common vision where we can really all come together and start to see who's doing what in certain regions and how can we pool resources, how can we maximize and find synergies to ensure that we are supporting each other. and ensuring that we are supporting the development of urban areas and supporting the needs of low-income and vulnerable communities. So really that need to kind of break the silos and come together and find out, synergies and opportunities of working together. And I think your platform starts to do that, but I think we need to start to do that in, targeted strategic areas that we, come together and work in.
Great, thanks very much. No one else seems to have indicated a question. There might be some time at the end for questions for both Sanji and Paula. So thank you very much in the meantime, Sanji, and we'll hand over to Paula. And I'll just upload your presentation now. Oh.
Last slide.
Yeah.
So okay, great. Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to Sanji. And I noticed, like during her talks, that she already picked up some points that I will partly also repeat. So in some slides I will go a bit quicker than in others. So my topic today are urban labor markets, as already indicated. So current trends and challenges in the global south. And my agenda is, after a short introduction, what is different with with labor markets in the global south, what are challenges ahead, and specifically I will be looking at the informal sector, but also the youth bulge and public transportation. I will look at solutions and then finalize with case studies. Next slide. So the pace of urbanization worldwide, as also Sanjay has already indicated, is rapidly growing, and this is already a graph a few years old, but still, like you here see clearly the trend, like rural populations are pretty stable, while urban population is continuously growing and people are moving to cities, like secondary cities, but also like bigger cities. Next slide. And this is not only a trend overall, but here you can see in this slide also different world regions in 3 different years, so 1950, 2014, and 2050. And you see here that in Africa, that was still a very, very rural region in the 1950s, is becoming more and more urban. And in 2050, also Africa will be very urbanized, as already also Sanjay has indicated, but also all other regions in the world will be mainly urban by 2050. Next slide. And not only that, people are moving more and more to urban areas, also cities are becoming larger over time. Also here we have a few columns that are showing different years. And in the year 2030, we will have 41 mega cities defined as a city with 10 million or more inhabitants. So not only will people be living in urban areas, but the city they live in will be larger. So any challenges associated with big cities will also increase in their size. And next slide. And many of these new mega cities will be located in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And also here we see 3 different world maps. And a lot of these red dots that are these mega cities with 10 million or more people will be in Asia, specifically like in South Asia around India, in China, in Southeast Asia, in the southern part of Africa, and in some cities in Latin America. Next slide. So why are cities growing so rapidly? So of course there's the growth just by the city itself, like the population growth. But if we look at the rural urban migration, we see here mainly pull factors and push factors. So the pull factors are in urban areas and push factors in rural areas. So let's start with the pull factors, that urban areas on average offer more and better jobs. So people moving to these cities, they have the possibility to engage in higher productive activities. The type of jobs are different, so there are the availability of non-farm jobs, so people can move out of agriculture. And there are also more and better services, again on average, access to higher quality healthcare, education, infrastructure, entertainment, and so on. And of course, not everyone will be equally exposed to these better services, but people still move with the hope of being able to access such services. So while of course services play a role, employment perspectives are a very important factor. When we look now at these push factors in rural area, we have on the one hand population pressures. So we are looking here at fixed farmland in rural areas where families cannot, let's say, forever divide their farmlands among their children. So this leads to land pressure and also soil erosion. And more generally, there's a lack of jobs, particularly outside of agriculture, and low wages. And next slide. But then what does it mean that cities grow so fast? Yeah, there's first of all a pressure on jobs. So even though people move because of the jobs, at the same time they create pressure on jobs. And this leads to a lot of vulnerable employment, large informal labor markets, and pressure on the services that these people seek in the cities. And beyond that, and this is also what Sanjay has already addressed, it can lead to a range of further problems, for example, crime, pollution, slum building, bad housing. So all what also Sanjay already indicated in her presentation. Okay, next slide. Then it's like, again, like the question, why are urban labor markets in the global south different? Because of course also in Europe and North America, we have experienced this urbanization, also this rapid urbanization. The one point is that migration does not follow job creation. So in Europe, this was very different during industrialization. So jobs were created, people moved to cities, and jobs were available for these people to start working. So compared to this situation, a large number of young migrants looking for alternatives outside this so far like traditional farming jobs are coming to the cities, but jobs are not there. So this formal economy wage jobs do not exist, or only to a very small extent, and generally not accessible for those who migrate from rural areas, also because they lack the skills, they lack the knowledge, and they lack very often network and contacts. And this all leads to high levels of informality and vulnerable employment. So what is very often, what can be very often seen is this type of own account work, for example, informal micro enterprises or street vendors or domestic workers. So employment is often casual, on demand, without labor safety standards or social security. Next slide. So just to visualize for you like a few facts. Did you know that more than 300 million workers in emerging and developing countries having a per capita household income or consumption of less than $1.90 per day? So this is the official poverty line. So imagine like this large amount of people actually working in cities, but not being able even to meet basic needs. In Africa, 61% of urban employment is in the informal sector. So also like we have again here a giant labor market that is practically flying under the radar, where no taxes are levied, where no social security is applied to. So a large number of people face this insecure employment conditions. And then finally, did you know that in the next decade, 1 billion young people will enter the labor market, and large numbers of young people face a future of irregular and informal employment? Also addressed by Sanjay already, that Africa is the youngest continent, and I will talk about this more about in a bit, so that we have a large number of youth that are entering this labor market and that they seek employment, but they will only, to a large extent, only find this vulnerable type of jobs that face this irregularity of the informal sector. Okay, next slide. So this is the first and also major challenge that I will be addressing during this presentation. So this is the size of the informal economy worldwide. And you can easily see in this map that Asia, Africa, Latin America, they're all like in different shades of blue, and the darker the blue, the more, the higher the informality. And here already agriculture is excluded. So agriculture that to a large extent is informal in these regions. And even without agriculture, we have approximately 2 billion workers, so aged 15 or more, that work informally. And this represents nearly 2/3 of global employment. So for you to get an idea of to what extent we're talking here, like the size of the informal economy. Okay, thanks. Next slide. The good news, however, is that informality has been declining over the past 2.5 decades. So we see here in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, practically in all world regions, with the exception of South Asia, informality is going down. So this is the good news. But however, and what is also like very easy to see, the informality rates remain persistently high in these world regions. Okay, next slide. Where do we see informality in cities? So I have listed here sectors in which urban informal workers operate. So actually any kind of sector that we find in a city, be it from construction to manufacturing, trade, and services. So really, like throughout the different sectors, you will find informal workers. So this is nothing of a particular sector. And within these sectors, we have also different types of informal workers. Most of them, not all, I have to emphasize, but most of these urban informal workers are and will remain poor and vulnerable. And there are different reasons for this. So like I have here listed a couple of reasons, but for example, a stigmatization, penalization for being illegal. So laws are favoring first and foremost formal firms. So there are also policies and laws in place very often work against these informal workers and informal businesses. They have a lack of access to public spaces, to services, to procurement. They lack social protection, social security, but also labor safety standards. And they lack also representative voice in policy making and rule setting. Next slide. And this all is further spurred by a youth bulge in Africa, particularly. So Africa's youth population is growing rapidly, like you can see here, like this dotted line in red, not so much in other regions, but specifically in Africa, there's the expectation that the young population will more than double by 2050. So this, of course, means also that a large number of young people will enter the labor market, and many of them will do so in cities. Also, again, because jobs in agriculture are not sufficient, they're low paid, and they will move to cities in order to find higher productive, better paid jobs. Next slide. This slide then shows that unemployment levels are highest among the youth. So these are also, this is also a type of population that's very vulnerable and will face a challenge of actually finding employment. These are various cities, these are very countries in Africa. So we see here that some countries in particularly, such as Ethiopia, Lesotho, and above all South Africa, face extremely high unemployment rates. Unemployment rates are high in any case, for example, South Africa with 20% for the adult population, but among the young people, these are up to 50% are not in employment, and this is an incredibly large number of young people who cannot be productive. And with the lack of jobs comes a lot of other problems, like lack of security, lack of being able to find housing, lack of being able to start a family, and so on. Next slide. A further challenge in these developing regions are the reliance of car ownership. So this is an example from Nairobi, and these figures show that a lot of jobs in these cities are actually not accessible if people do not have an own car. And the reason is that public transportation is very often limited, it is unorganized, chaotic, expensive also, and yeah, specifically non-reliable. Minibuses are the most common means of public transportation, and this is particularly used by the poorer population. But yeah, commuter trains or buses, specifically those that are reliable, that are affordable, they often are lacking. And this lack of public transportation and of transport infrastructure that is fitting the needs of the poorer population actually bars them from accessing jobs in the city. Next slide. Then we come to different solutions, and first of all, also already addressed by Sanji, is that key actors need to work together. So the single informal worker will lack the agency and will lack also the power to do any big changes. But the key actors will need to work together to make any significant changes. And when I talk about key actors, these are organization of informal workers, civil society, government, also academia and development agencies. I'm here listing some ideas for ensuring inclusive cities, and then this will of course depend on a case-of-case basis, on the context, on the situation of specific informal workers, on their wishes and their needs. So first of all, a recognition of informal workers and the organization. They often fly under the radar, they're not visual for policy, so the recognition that they exist, like both the individual informal worker and the organizations, are an important first step. The development of participatory platforms, so all voices can be heard, so that we all understand the needs and the wishes that they have. The provision of basic infrastructure service, so for example, public spaces where they can set up businesses, the provision of improved and affordable transport, as particularly public transportation, and inclusion of proper workers in municipal budgets. Next slide. I have then here two short case studies. I will not go into them into detail. So the first one is in Delhi, India, about home-based workers, which in the vast majority belong to the informal sector. So they have approached, they have adopted an approach that focuses on improving employment conditions for workers. Next slide. And these are a couple of examples what they have implemented. So, for example, they provided skills training and upgrading. They provided social security and other services, expanded market, advocated for workers. So the whole range of different approaches that they have initiated, like processes that were relevant for these informal workers. But this also shows these approaches that it's not one specific task that needs to be tackled, but a whole range of different tasks that work together and that improve the situation of these informal workers. And next slide. And this is also still an overview of what has been indeed then achieved by, in this specific case. Here again, like pointing out, for example, that embroidery workers increased their cumulative income by 50%. So this is quite a bit, at least percentage-wise. They have achieved cash income increases, developed market linkages. So indeed, like quite a lot of achievement that can be substantiated and really here visually shown that that has improved the situation of these workers. In the next slide. Then this is a second case study from Ghana. These are market traders that aimed at improving the occupational health and safety, or short OHS. So these cities market traders, they faced unsafe and unhygienic working conditions, for example, inadequate lighting and storage, harassment from local authorities, fire breakout, poor ventilation, and so on. Next slide. And what is interesting in this case that they have achieved better OHS, but not individually, but once they organize themselves and learned as a group. So, for example, they have managed to create a new bus station, bath toilets, and lorry park, commitment for construction of a pedestrian shopping mall, commitment for drain clearing and waste disposal, representation on municipal bodies. So also this example shows the importance of organizing themselves in a group and with different key actors. Okay, next slide. Then finally, the key takeaways from this presentation. Like, first of all, urban labor markets in the global south are characterized by a large informal sector. So this is spurred by the number of youth in Africa entering the job market over the next couple of years. Arriving migrants to the cities will be largely absorbed by the informal economy. The formal jobs are lacking compared to Europe during industrialization, and jobs in the informal economy are in their majority vulnerable. Many of them many of the jobs that do exist are also not accessible by those people, but there's a lack of, for example, public transportation, but also other barriers. Second is that coordinated efforts among key actors are required to ensure inclusive cities. I guess it has already been mentioned many times, but I cannot emphasize this again and again, so that the single informal worker lacks agency to initiate his policy changes needed, and that any policy solution must take into account the reality in which these workers operate, so to really understand what they need, what are the challenges, and what are their wishes to improve the situation. Okay, that it is from my side. Thank you very much. And the last slide is, yeah, in case you need, you would like to contact me for any further inquiries, this is also my contact, and I'm happy now to take questions.
Great, thanks very much, Paula. We have a question for you and Sanji, actually, from Monica, about what we can do to better support migrants in getting jobs or housing when they have the challenges of being illegal or lacking documentation, and also insecure mobility.
Should I start? Should Sanji start?
Well, you've got the mic at the moment, Paula, so go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So I think it's very difficult to give, let's say, one right answer to this. But what I have also worked a lot on informal entrepreneurship, and what I see is very often like people remain informal because formalizing businesses, or even also as this, what's her name, Monica, right, like the lack of documentation and the illegal status of this person. Like it's incredible. How to say, like a very high administration and bureaucratic burden on these people. And I think a very important first step would be to lower this administrative burden in cities. So for example, if we have informal workers or small micro entrepreneurs, that they can easily register their businesses or even themselves as persons somewhere without, let's say, this high costs, high waiting times, a lot of different steps to formalize. So this would be something that I have seen in my work on entrepreneurship that would be really an important first step.
Thank you. Sanji, did you want to come in on that as well?
Thank you, Vicky. So from my perspective, I mean, looking at things from a, say, a slum community or an informal perspective, I think it's important to take a community versus a household or individual approach. So I would think it would be important to, work with communities, to give voice to communities, to understand what their needs and priorities are, and to sort of address, for example, if they had needs in terms of basic services or water and sanitation, that you address it from a community perspective. And that would apply, I think, the same to sort of, you wouldn't look at titling at an individual level, and at most levels you'd look at more addressing community needs and priorities, supporting community livelihoods needs. So really taking a community approach rather than focusing on individuals, and also facilitating greater discussions between communities that are informal or illegal and relevant government institutions, and really just bridging and facilitating that gap to promote more inclusive development rather than separating and dividing communities.
Great, thanks very much. We are at our time now. I just wanted to flag that we have one more webinar planned in this series for the 3rd of June, where we will be joined by World Vision and CordAid. So we hope you can join us for that. Are there any final questions? There's nothing in the chat and there's no one self-unmuting, but if you have any final question, this is probably your chance to say. I think that's it. So I just wanted to thank everyone for your time, particularly thank you to the two presenters, Sanji and Paula. There's a lot of food for thought in your presentations. We will send round a copy of 2 YouTube links, one of this webinar and one of the video that I apologise again for not being able to play. And we hope to see you again on the 3rd of June. But thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.